Hello, I'm Dr. John Kavanagh, and welcome back. AJS101, Introduction to Criminal Justice, Lesson 11, the last lesson in this course. And it's part one, which is the only part of this lesson. So let's get going. This chapter is about the structure, conditions, and problems of prisons and jails today. So let's first talk about prisons. A prison is a place of incarceration, usually run by a state government or the federal government for persons who are sentenced to 1 year or more of incarceration. There are over 1,000 prisons in the United States holding over 1 million inmates. The prison population in the U.S. has tripled in size since 1980, with many of the inmates being imprisoned for violent crimes and drug-related crimes. Although most of the drug-related crimes usually involve trafficking or the sale of large quantities and not mere possession. And only about 6% of prisoners are women. Again, crime is a male-dominated occupation, if you want to call it that. Now, most prisons are overcrowded. As a state legislator, I can tell you that when the long list of wants come in, people saying they need money, disabled people, students, teachers, health providers, kind of at the bottom of the list are prisons. So they don't get enough money, which causes overcrowding. The prisoners themselves tend to be poor, uneducated, unskilled, and from minority backgrounds. And many are drug abusers and drug addicts, which plays into their criminal occupations. And it costs roughly about $11,000 a year to house an inmate. Now, this depends on the level of security. If the prisoner is in a supermax facility, it might be $50,000 a year. If the prisoner is in a low-level minimum security facility, it might just be $6,000 or $7,000 a year. Before we leave this page, we should talk a little bit about the growth of the prison population since the 1980s. This was not just the result of people saying, let's get tougher on crime. Things have been changing in this country, certainly during my lifetime. We had nowhere near the amount of drug offenses, nowhere near the amount of brutal violence, no more near the amount of juvenile, real serious crime back in those days than we did starting in the 60s and 70s and growing in the 80s and into the 90s. And because of this scary spike in really violent crime, scary spike in juvenile violent crime also, the legislators responded to the public outcry and got tougher on crime and increased the sentences. Truth in sentencing laws, where prisoners have to spend, in the case of Arizona, 85% of their sentence behind bars and can't be let out early. And that was also in response to abuses in the parole system, where prisoners were released not because they were cured, but because there was overcrowding in the prison and they needed room. So somebody who was sentenced to 20 years gets out in 5 and then reoffends and kills somebody, and the people hear about it and they get incensed. So there are a lot of reasons why we have far more people in prison today than before, and it's not just because of a sudden desire to punish everybody more. I might also add that while there are some states that have, and maybe even still have, and even the federal government, a disproportionately large number of people in prison for drug possession only. In the state of Arizona, roughly 95% of the prisoners are either violent criminals, repeat offenders, or both. We have very few drug possession alone prisoners in Arizona, and they usually possess an awful lot of drugs, which usually means a presumption of sale or trafficking. Okay, let's talk about the philosophy of imprisonment. Now, prisons were originally built to rehabilitate, cure criminals as an alternative to corporal punishment. Going back to colonial times and before, people who committed crimes were beaten or killed. So putting them incarcerated was actually a humane treatment-centered twist in the philosophy of imprisonment. However, today the philosophy of retribution tends to be the guiding principle. And retribution is a nice word for revenge. Now, the justice model of imprisonment uses the sentencing philosophy of just deserts, which states that the criminal deserves punishment appropriate to the type and also the severity of the crime committed. So this is called just deserts. It's pretty much retribution in that you deserve punishment, but it has proportionality, fairness. Serious crimes get serious punishments, minor crimes get minor punishments, and in the middle get in the middle punishments. That's called just deserts. You deserve to be punished for the harm that you did. Other get tough policies growing in popularity include the abolition of parole. And as I mentioned, that's because there were many cases where people who weren't cured were released from prison because of overcrowding, and they went out and they committed brutal murders or rapes, and the public found out about this and got really upset. So many states, including Arizona, abolished parole. Of course, the prosecutors had a little bit of a workaround on that, and they began having prisoners sentenced to a term of incarceration followed by probation. Now, remember, probation is very similar to parole, except probation was in lieu of going to jail or prison, whereas parole was early release from prison. But they both involved supervision by a parole or probation officer and conditions. So we get rid of parole, and the prosecutors simply rename it as probation, as incarceration with probation on the end. I've been a state legislator for 13 years, and I can tell you, we often play whack-a-mole, where we think we correct something and somebody finds a way around it, and we have to whack that again, and that's kind of what happened there. Abolition of parole was get tough. The removal of privileges like cable TV and weights. There were so many pictures in the 60s and 70s of prisoners in the yard lifting weights, as you can see on this slide, building their muscles up, theoretically, so when they leave, they can kick the crap out of cops who want to arrest them. That didn't go over too well with police officers or the general public. And some prisons had cable TV, which was upsetting to some people who couldn't afford cable on the outside. And of course, there were also chain gangs. Although chain gangs, humorously, are not despised, get tough, mean punishments. There's usually a waiting list to go on the chain gang if you're in prison, because the chain gang leaves the prison. They go out into the woods or the streets to pick up litter or do fire brush control. It's actually a lot nicer than being in a cell or making license plates or something like that. So even though, and by the way, they usually aren't chained. These are usually prisoners near the end of their term who have a low risk of escaping, and they just kind of walk around. We have a lot of them at the Capitol. They're dressed in orange, and they do all sorts of landscaping around the Capitol. Again, it's cheap labor, but they like it because they get out of the jail. So it's not really a get tough situation. It's not like chain gangs in the 1920s where they're all on chains doing backbreaking, brutal labor, in farm fields or the like, or breaking rocks with sledgehammers. That's kind of movie stuff. All right, let's talk about overcrowding. In 1997, state prisons were 20% over capacity. Federal prisons were a little bit higher, around 25% over. And this is mostly due to underfunding. Now, overcrowding alone is not unconstitutional so long as other essential services like medical care and nutrition are provided. Now, one solution to overcrowding is a sentencing philosophy, or more like a procedure, I guess, called selective incapacitation. Selective incapacitation involves creating predictors of recidivism, repeat offending, and basically seeing where a prisoner scores on this recidivism formula. And if a prisoner has a high risk of reoffending, especially in a violent crime, they get the maximum sentence. They are essentially put in prison for a longer time which incapacitates them. It makes them unable to harm people because they're not on the outside, they're on the inside. And usually researchers, college, university professors would look at the criminal records of many criminals, and they would predict what factors would cause somebody to reoffend very quickly. Factors like committing robbery, the first crime being committed at a young age, these are higher predictors of recidivism than other factors. And they work out these formulas and validate them. Selective incapacitation identifies offenders with a higher risk of recidivism and attempts to incarcerate them for longer times, preferably through their crime-prone years. Now, the crime-prone years tend to be roughly 18 to 30. That's when people tend to commit more crimes, especially street crimes we're talking about. And that's usually because they're young, they're immature, high levels of testosterone, and they have less ties to the community. They may not be married or have jobs, because marriage and jobs tends to root you into society, and you have more to lose and you don't want to commit crimes, as opposed to somebody who doesn't have a job and is young and unemployed and doesn't care. Some critics, of course, complain that due to difficulties in predicting recidivism, selective incapacitation produces too many false positives. A false positive is a statistical term. It means the program predicted that this person was a positive, that they would reoffend, but they were wrong because they wouldn't have reoffended. That's a false positive. The opposite of a false positive is a false negative. And that's where the program predicts that the person will not reoffend, but they do reoffend. Obviously, you really don't want to have false negatives because then you have victims on the street. But false positives aren't great either, because then you have people who are incarcerated who, assuming you're not incarcerating them from a just desserts perspective, but just a incapacitation perspective, are there unnecessarily. Okay. Let's talk about security levels in prisons and jails. Prisoners are assigned to institutions based upon the type of crime they committed, their perceived flight risk, and their danger level. So basically, when they're first sent to a prison, they often spend the first week or two in a reception center. And one of the things that's done is their current crime, their past criminal record is inspected to see how dangerous are they? How much of a flight risk are they? If you're a millionaire who's been sentenced to 30 years and you have the resources, if you can get over the fence to flee the country, you're a high escape risk. By the same token, if you have multiple repeat recidivist violent crimes, you are a high danger level. If in prison the last time you assaulted a lot of inmates and other prisoners, you are a danger risk. And of course, the type of crime. Certain criminals, like sex offenders, are usually put in segregated areas away from the general population because they are considered the bottom of the barrel, being sex offenders, especially child molesters, and they get beaten up by other criminals. So there are 3 levels of security: maximum, medium, and minimum. So maximum security institutions are surrounded by walls, or the more newly constructed ones usually have multiple high fences with razor ribbon on top. And in the area between the fences, they'll have motion detectors and maybe even more razor wire, or maybe even a third fence in the middle, which is electrified. In a maximum security institution, the prisoners are kept in cells most of the time. They keep prisoners in small cells, and they limit the movement of prisoners. They're not free to walk around to their jobs or out on the ball field. They're much more closely controlled because they don't want them assaulting correctional staff or assaulting each other. But these are dangerous people. Minimum security institutions often have no walls or fences. They let prisoners walk around. They're housed in dormitories or private rooms. It's almost like a college-like atmosphere. And the prisoners are on their honor not to escape. And again, these are prisoners who don't usually have a lot of repeat offending histories. They're not recidivists. They usually have committed nonviolent crimes, a lot of white-collar crimes or theft crimes. And they may often be near the end of their sentence where they would be crazy to escape and risk a new offense and being sent back to a higher level of security. You also have supermax facilities, and the supermax facilities are for the worst of the worst. Supermax facility, prisoners are alone in a cell. The cells are often opened and closed electronically, so the correctional officers don't even go near the cells. They're in a control tower or a control room where they can view all the cells. Prisoners are let out once a day for a outside recreation experience that usually is 1 hour in a cage outside. So the correctional officers would open the cell door, the prisoner would walk on their own to this outside cage, through a secured passageway. They'd be monitored on videotape for their hour in the cage. Then they're told to go back in, their cell is locked, and the next prisoner goes through that same routine. Showers and baths maybe once a week. Their meals are usually delivered by a correctional staff person, but there's usually a small opening in the door, and that little opening is open and it becomes a shelf. The food tray is placed on that. The correctional officer steps back, and then the supermax prisoner approaches and takes the food and puts it in their cell. There's no close contact, so they can't grab the correctional officer and try to yank his or her arm off. So those are supermax for the worst of the worst. So most prisons offer some level of education and vocational training, recreation, religious activities, rehabilitation, and counseling. Obviously, the lower security level, the more you have of this. I already spoke about supermax facilities, so I won't repeat that. Let's talk about jails. We just finished talking about prisons. Remember, prisons are for people who have been sentenced to a year or more. They're run by the state or by the federal government if it's a federal crime. Let's talk about jails. Jails are short-term confinement facilities that hold prisoners who are awaiting arraignment, the first appearance. There are holding prisoners who are awaiting trial and could not make bail, or persons convicted of felonies who are awaiting transfer to a state prison, and those convicted and sentenced to less than a year in incarceration. That's who go to jails. And jails are usually run by local governments, cities, towns, counties. At any moment, about 500,000 people are in U.S. jails, and only about 10% of the population of jails are female. A little bit more than prisons, which, as you recall, were 6% female. So you have 10%. You have slightly more females because you do have people not convicted of crimes here. And you also have a lot of people who are convicted of less serious crimes, minor drug possession, prostitution, shoplifting, which tend to be crimes that females have a higher proportion of offenders. About 50% of persons in jails are pre-trial detainees, or those in the trial stage of adjudication. In other words, they have not yet been convicted of anything, which, by the way, means that they're not allowed to be put on work details, even though they might want to, because it might actually make the day go faster. But only convicted inmates can be put on work details. Okay, jails, like prisons, are often overcrowded, and the inmates are mostly minorities. Jails are particularly deficient in providing facilities and care for female inmates who are often drug addicts and may be pregnant. Co-correctional arrangements often alleviate this problem. A co-correctional arrangement is where men and women inmates are in the same jail, or prison, I suppose. There are not that many of them. There tends to be a situation where the male prisoners behave better. They groom themselves better. They don't curse and yell as much as they do before. They're kind of on their good behavior. So I guess women have something of a civilizing effect on the male prisoners. Sometimes the co-correctional arrangements aren't in the actual where they live, although even in co-correctional, they're in separate areas. They're not sharing cells, obviously. But they may even be in nearby prisons and share the same classrooms for training. That's another co-correctional manner. But there's always the danger of fights between males over female inmates and sex between inmates. So that becomes a problem with co-correctional. So it's not that popular. So jails tend to be more overcrowded than prisons, again, because they're less funded. Jails are more rundown, again, funding, understaffed, and they provide fewer inmate services. Again, that's because of a lack of funding. It's also because most inmates are in and out of jails pretty quickly, so it's kind of hard to assess them, get them into programs with any kind of meaningful reward, because there's little time to educate or rehabilitate. And also a lack of inmate classification makes jails more dangerous. They do try to do some classification, but not nearly as thorough as are done in prisons where the person's going to be staying for years. So it's not unusual in jails to have very dangerous, serious offenders mixed in with first-time minor offenders, and the first-time minor offenders are often victimized in those situations. Finally, let's talk about private prisons. So private prisons are correctional institutions operated by private companies on behalf of governments. In other words, the local government, the federal government, or the state government says, we don't want to build another prison. We don't want to have to hire the correctional officers and pay, rather expensive pensions to them. Let's avoid all of this and simply contract with a private company who will build the prison, hire the private employees to be the correctional officers and the nutritionists and everybody else who works in a prison, health providers. They're a recent innovation, but it's gaining traction and popularity. Arizona has a number of private prisons, and the studies basically have shown that they provide pretty much the same level of care, but they are cheaper. The main reason they're cheaper is that private correctional officers and other employees don't get government pensions. A correctional officer's pension is often like a police pension. It could be half pay after 20 years, which is very, very expensive. But even regular state pensions and local pensions of government employees are extremely expensive, which is why most of these public pension systems are going bankrupt, and governments have to put a lot of extra money into them. With private prisons, they're kind of like people in private companies. They may have a 401k style of pension where the employer contributes and they contribute, which is not as costly. So that's why private prisons are less expensive, but they again do provide the same level of service, because the contracts all call for government inspectors to be on site 24/7 if desired, to make sure that the terms of the contract are being fulfilled. And the government writes the contracts, so they can say how many hours of rehabilitation, how many hours of training, food levels. They can pretty much dictate the standards, even training for the private correctional officers. Now, some claim that private prisons are not as accountable for their actions as government prisons, which create a greater potential for abuse. However, many public prisons have been found to have abused prisoners in spite of their accountability. And on-site government inspectors can solve the accountability problem. Some of the worst prison conditions and some of the worst prison riots occurred in public prisons. The term Attica, an upstate New York correctional facility, which in the 1960s had a riot where guards and prisoners were killed, is symbolic of badly run public prisons. And there have been other similar situations in public prisons. So you really can't make a generalization, public versus private. It has to do with who runs them, the accountability they have to the state government, and the rules and standards which the state government imposes on a private prison company. Now, others say that private prisons are incentivized to not rehabilitate prisoners so as to get the recidivism return business. But there is no evidence of this, and rehabilitation services are provided at the level of government dictates and pays for. So if the state government wants to have really involved programs to end recidivism, they can put that in the contract. The government will pay for that, and the private prison will happily run those programs because they'll make more of a profit. The more activities, the larger the contract, the greater the share of profit that the private prison will make. So that argument really has no basis in fact. Now, there are some legal problems that exist, but they can easily be solved. You have to change state law to allow private correctional officers to be able to use force to control prisoners. But that's not really a big deal. And as long as they're properly screened and trained, they're not really that much different than government correctional officers. So private prisons are here to stay because they provide pretty much the same level of service, but they're a lot cheaper. All right, that ends lesson 11 and this course. So as always, you should study. Study your chapter readings, study your PowerPoint presentation, and study all of the questions, right? If you were using a written copies of all the tests in a manual, or you downloaded them, you should have all the correct answers, the ones you wrote in, and if you got them wrong, the ones you corrected when you looked at the website. You can also go to the Canvas website and go to your quizzes page, your grades page. You can look at all of your tests and it'll say which answers were correct, and for the ones you got wrong, it'll say which was the correct answer. You want to review every lesson question because the final exam consists of about 100 roughly multiple choice questions, every one taken from the chapter quizzes. So go over all those questions, know the correct answers, and you will ace the final exam. And I wish you the best of luck on the final exam.